Welcome back to Breaking Tech on Vision on TV, down at the Open Tech Conference in London. I'm talking to Bill Thompson, who has some, we hope, polemical things to say about the state of free software and open source development and related matters. Now, there is something in the abstract of your talk, Bill, which immediately caught my eye, where you said, are we, meaning people that make free software and so forth, are we, in terms of the development, are we more Genghis Khan than Gutenberg?
Yep.
Which are we?
Well, I think the jury is out in the sense we could be either. And the point about saying that is Gutenberg in 1450 perfected printing with movable type, and the spread of literacy and the spread of the printed book around Europe and the rest of the world radically changed the culture that he grew up in. So all the tales he was told about the disruptive effects of printing were true. It undermined the authority of the church, it led to religious wars and killed millions of people, it challenged established hierarchies, and it gave us the Reformation, it gave us the Enlightenment, and looking back we consider that to be a good thing. But from Gutenberg's perspective, as someone who was just tinkering and creating a system, he might not have been happy with the outcome. That the things he valued in his world, religious certainty, hierarchy, whatever, were destroyed by his invention. Genghis Khan, on the other hand, single-mindedly supported and worked for the Mongol Empire that he was creating. The millions of people he killed were outsiders. He unified the language, unified the script, unified the laws, created an enormous empire that dominated Central Europe and Eurasia for many years. So in terms of supporting his people, he was an enormous success. Okay, lots of people died, and we shouldn't ignore that. But from the perspective of free software developers, from the perspective of those who advocate open source, from the perspective of people who built the Linux operating system and the Apache web server, who have constructed the core technologies that make the internet possible and that underpin the business models of many large capitalist corporations, I think it's worth asking ourselves at this moment, do we act in our interest, Genghis Khan model, or do we accept the things we're doing are going to be disruptive and they may not even benefit us as we are now? So I'm old enough to have lived through the development of many of the core technologies. I'm 50. The world's first stored program digital computers were constructed in 1949, 1950, 10 years before I was born. I've lived through the development of the mini computer, the micro, smartphones. I first used the internet in 1984 when it was a year old. I've watched these technologies happen, and even I find myself sometimes gasping at the rate of change and at how much has shifted in my life and in my world. I know that many other people have the same problem. But we now live here in the West in a world that is dominated by the capabilities of the network. You open a copy of the free Metro paper in London, you find stories about Facebook, about Twitter, about Google, you find all that sort of stuff. The network, the technologies, computers are now the defining space. We, geeks, built it. We are deploying it, we're watching it become dominant, and we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we then act in the broader interest? It's not enough just to try to keep this to ourselves. If we give it away, it may be subverted. How do we engage or begin to engage politically around the technologies that we understand so well, that we have shaped? How do we ensure that the values built into those tools as we release them are those that will promote the things that I personally value? Freedom of expression, social justice, equality, all those things, or do we just cede that space to others? So I think there's a real political argument to be had around the implications of these free tools and free software at the moment, and now is the time to have it.
Okay, but there are problems with the internet. I mean,
what sort of problems would they be?
Well, net neutrality, for instance, is still campaigned on, which is bizarre because it's basically dead. And it's going. I mean, you're already throttled depending on what you do in the internet.
Net neutrality is not about throttling. Net neutrality is about the core principle that if you're paying for a certain level of access to the network and the people you're talking to at the other end are paying for a certain level of access, then what you get is what you've both paid for. It's not about saying you don't do throttling of bandwidth. It's about saying you don't do preferential treatment of services, and that it's, you know, if I'm throttled on BitTorrent and on Skype and on email and on the web. So the principle of net neutrality is preserved. I'm not just not paying enough to a good enough ISP to get the quality of service that I want. I think there's a different issue there. So the problems the internet has at this moment are actually quite relatively unimportant. They're a consequence of the fact that in the last 10 years we have used up the bonus we got from the dot-com crash in 2000. In 1989, 1999 and 2000, companies spent billions of dollars of venture capital money building infrastructure, and then they all went out of business. They had put into the ground more bandwidth, more fiber capacity, they'd built the servers, they put the routers, and we've only just now reached the limits of using that bonus. And so we're up against the problems of underinvestment by the ISPs and the telcos. That's why the debate about net neutrality. That's a temporary blip. The network is far too important not to be invested in. The improvements in the technology are far too significant for us not to have, you know, gigabit access to the network everywhere within 5 or 10 years. So that's not the thing that worries me. What worries me are the broader implications for the wider society about building politics and social life and education systems and the economic sort of basis of society all around the capabilities of the high-speed networks, digital files, computers and stuff like that.
Can you give us a concrete example of sort of Genghis Khan behaviour? Building your empire ruthlessly.
Well, obviously Facebook would be the prime example of a company that's decided to break as many standards as it can, break as many social conventions as it can, and support and sustain only those people who are part of the Facebook tribe, so that if you're in Facebook you get all these enormous benefits, but you've paid the price of joining. And if you're outside Facebook, then what you can see is very limited. Your use of the stuff is limited because they don't support the web standards. So, you know, I say that would be a good example of that sort of thinking. And to some extent, I suppose you could say that Google is the Gutenberg thinking, where what they're doing is trying to suck everything in but making it available. They're trying to be open and transparent. And the problem is that doing that leads them into conflict with established rights holders, for example, with governments, with all those sorts of people. Google has such fluid boundaries. It's not about defending Google, it's about defending the digital culture. And whilst they have become very rich and powerful on the back of it, their interest is broader. Facebook is about Facebook.
Yeah, okay. So what's your prediction for the future? I mean, you were saying when we talked that the revolution is won, and so what do we do with it?
Well, the revolution's over, as in, well, rather, the transition has happened. That certainly here in the West, we're already in a culture which is shaped by the affordances of digital technologies and electronic devices and high-speed networks. And how that plays out is up for grabs. My argument here at OpenTech is that we need to acknowledge that and be responsible, that we need to start thinking politically. The metaphor I used was about feathers. So feathers are really interesting because feathers evolved to keep animals warm. And down feathers on animals, ducks, whatever, if you have a look at one, are symmetrical. Feathers that are used to fly are not symmetrical because the evolutionary adaptation pressure is to use the feathers to create an aerofoil, a surface that controls the flow of air so that you can have wings and control surfaces and you can fly. So feathers had to become asymmetrical in order to be effective, to allow birds to take flight.
Sure.
So far, free software has given us down feathers. Linux keeps us warm at night. Apache comforts us. We need to start the process of evolving flight feathers that will change the world and allow us to soar.
Okay, what does that require? Resources or attitude and so on? I mean, I go to hack labs and things like this, and I talk to alternative, radical people committed to this kind of development. And and the projects I'm suggesting are smaller and smaller these days, in the hope that one of them will actually get done with a UI that I can use.
Yeah.
So is there a need for a change of mentality, or what would actually enable this to happen?
Well, I think partly it's just realising that it is happening. So the change that's needed is to say that just as 100, 200 years ago, social campaigners realised that trying to improve the lives of the working class couldn't just be done by soup kitchens, but it needed infrastructural investment in sewers, it needed legal change, it needed the Poor Act to be reformed, it needed an education system and all those sorts of things. We can't just hack our Arduinos or our embeds, and we can't just build cool user interfaces for our tools. We need to be engaged as hackers and as geeks at all levels to ensure that the understanding that we have innately about the capabilities of these digital tools and the sort of society we could build on top of them becomes reflected in every level of society.
Okay. Bill, thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Richard.
We'll be back for another show soon.